When I first decided to research the conflict between the United States and Iran, I thought I already knew what the topic was about. I assumed it was mainly a political and military disagreement between two governments that simply didn't get along. But as I started researching, I realized I had been looking at the conflict far too narrowly. Once I noticed that nearly every article connected the conflict to oil, trade, and the global economy, then all I could think about was how many people are affected by events happening thousands of miles away. What started as a project about foreign policy became a project about how interconnected our world really is. So in this video, I want to tell the story of how researching the US-Iran conflict changed my perspective and forced me to rethink what international conflicts actually mean. To understand why this topic mattered so much, I first had to understand where the conflict came from. At first, I thought understanding the history would answer most of my questions. Instead, it raised an even bigger one. Why does a conflict between two countries affect people all over the world? Before researching, I knew about tensions between the United States and Iran, but I didn't know much about how those tensions began. As I learned more about the 1979 Iranian Revolution and the hostage crisis at the US Embassy in Tehran, I began to see how historical events can continue shaping relationships decades later. At first, I treated these events like background information that I needed for context. But the more I researched, the more I realized that history wasn't just background, it was still influencing decisions being made today. That realization changed the direction of my research. Once I understood the historical roots of the conflict, another question started bothering me. If this conflict has lasted for decades, why should the rest of the world care so much about it? This was the moment when my research really shifted. I expected to find discussions about military strategy and diplomacy. Instead, I kept finding articles about oil prices, shipping routes, and global trade. One source that stood out was a BBC article discussing the Strait of Hormuz. The article states that about 20% of global oil and gas flows through the Strait of Hormuz. When I first read that statistic, it completely changed how I viewed the conflict. I had never considered how a political dispute between two countries could affect fuel prices, transportation costs, and economies around the world. The quote made me realize that this wasn't just a regional issue, it was a global issue. So if one shipping route handles that much of the world's energy supply, then it makes sense that governments, businesses, and ordinary people everywhere pay attention whenever tensions increase in the region. But I wanted to know whether those economic effects were actually happening or if they were only theoretical. Understanding the importance of the Strait of Hormuz was one thing. Seeing its effects on the global economy was another. As I continued researching, I found evidence that markets often immediately react to tensions involving Iran. News reporters state that oil and gas prices surge following disruptions to shipping in the region. This quote stands out because it shows that economic effects aren't just possibilities, but that they happen in real time. Before researching this topic, I mostly thought about conflicts in terms of military action and diplomacy. After reading the reports like this, I started thinking about how people who might never follow international policies still experience the consequences through higher prices, economic uncertainty, or disruptions in trade. That was probably the biggest shift in my thinking throughout this project. By this point in my research, I wasn't really asking who was right or wrong anymore. Instead, I was asking why resolving conflicts like this matters to everyone. The deeper I researched, the more I realized this wasn't simply a story about Iran and the United States. It was a story about how interconnected modern society has become. One thing I learned from researching this topic is that ending conflicts is about more than avoiding war. Stability affects economies, international relationships, energy markets, and millions of people's daily lives. The more I researched, the more I understood why diplomacy remains such an important goal. Even when countries disagree, finding ways to reduce tensions can prevent larger consequences that affect people far beyond the countries involved. That realization ended up becoming the biggest takeaway for my entire project. Looking back, the most important thing I gained from this project wasn't a better understanding of the one conflict. It was a better understanding of how connected the world really is. When I began researching the US-Iran conflict, I thought I was studying a disagreement between two nations. By the end, I realized I was studying history, economics, trade, diplomacy, and globalization all at once. Researching this topic challenged my assumptions and changed the questions I was asking. And I think that's what good research is supposed to do. It doesn't just give us answers. Sometimes it changes the way we see the entire problem. Thank you for your listen. I hope you guys all learned something. My name is Sam Polyak, and you have a good one. Bye.